Okay, so recording again. Where's my Crash Bandicoot playlist? We're just gonna listen to Crash music because it's fitting. Crash Bandicoot. Crash Bandicoot favorites. Add to player. Shuffle. And start naturally with the Crash 1 theme because it was at the top of the playlist. How does that sound like volume-wise? I can probably turn it up a little bit. Press F11, please. You know, that's probably not a bad idea, Slots, actually. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, that's good. There we go. Okay. Okay, so this is going on YouTube, so I'm going to, I guess, intro or whatever. Let me, can I zoom in a little more? No, that's too much. Yeah, so this is a sub goal. I'm going to update my Crash tier list because the one I made a year ago is, like, really fucking outdated. You said you wanted to be a little louder, Tet? Maybe I can be able to get a little bit louder. Yeah, it's good. Whatever. I can't get it too loud. Alright, but yeah, so, yeah, we're going to do Crash tier list. Okay, no, that's too loud for my ears. I have to turn that down. I'm gonna be shouting if I do that, so. Okay, so a couple clarifications before I start this. The first clarification is there's no mobile phone games on this. Because the only mobile phone Crash game I've played is Crash Nitro Kart 2, and it was okay, but I haven't experienced any of the other ones, so I don't have enough of an opinion to judge them. I'm ranking the Insane Trilogy as 3 games because I think they all have their own merits to be compared to, as opposed to treating it as 1 game. And then, also the biggest disclaimer, this is my opinion. So if you disagree with me, that's fine. Because the beautiful thing about opinions is that everybody has different ones. And I have a lot of hot takes, so not everybody's gonna agree with me. Alright, I got notes this time, because the last time I did this, I went in completely blind. I just had a list and didn't really have any points. So hopefully this doesn't take an hour like the last one did. Okay. Alright, I'm gonna start from the bottom up, because that's just more interesting like that. So let's get the obvious out of the way. The worst Crash game. Where is it? Obviously Crash Boom Bang. Like, you can probably argue like 2 other games that are potentially worse, but I really just think like Crash Boom Bang is like an appalling dumpster fire of a game. Why isn't Boom Bang on its own tier list? You'll find out in a second. But like this game is so fucking bad. Like, it's got like some of the worst sound design. Like, all of the music is terrible. All of the sound effects and character voices are terrible. It's ugly as shit. Like, it's cel shaded, but it's cel shaded really poorly. Plot isn't really something that's a big deal in Crash for the most part, but even by like standards of the Crash series, this is a really shitty plot. All of the minigames are boring. It's almost entirely RNG. Like, there's so little skill involved in the game if there's really any at all. Which, like, yeah, party games generally have RNG, but like, it's even a little ridiculous for that. It doesn't even matter whether or not you win the minigames, because like, regardless of who wins the minigames, the game just progresses anyway, so there's no real incentive to try in the game. Like I said, there's 2 other games in the series that I'm gonna get to right after this that could also potentially be in contention for worst in the series, but their biggest issues are that they don't function. Crash Boom Bang functions fine. It's just that terrible. And that's generally why I give it the spot of worst game in the series. Like, honestly, like, Crash Boom Bang it transcends being the worst Crash game. It's just one of the worst party games ever, if not the worst, and it is absolutely one of the worst games I've ever played. Like, there's no redeeming qualities about Crash Boom Bang. It is just an awful, awful game. So yeah. So the next two, I'm gonna rank together because a lot of their issues are shared, but one of them I do consider better than the other. And that's gonna be Mind Over Mutant DS and wherever it is, Titans GBA. So I don't have the most experience with these games. I've only played a little bit of them, but I've played enough time. I've played enough to like understand why they're so bad. Generally, like the biggest issues with the game, they're not really all that functional. Titans GBA is especially bad about it because like it's like the 5th GBA game and it's like the worst performing out of all of them. Yes, Burger still has the Mom DS record. If I remember correctly, hit detection with like the combat is really bad in both of the games. Like it's really just like the biggest issue with these games is that they just don't work. And like Mind Over Mutant has like the same issues as Titans GBA. They're very similar games and like they have very similar problems. I put Titans GBA over Mind Over Mutant DS because Mind Over Mutant is on the DS, so it's on a more powerful console, so it has less of an excuse than Titans GBA does. But both of them are really bad games. So yeah, that's actually all there is in F tier. So I have like descriptions for like every tier. Actually, let me see if can I type? Okay, yeah. So games in F tier I consider unforgivably terrible, which doesn't fit, of course. Okay, so yeah, F tier, these are the 3 games in Crash that I consider to be just absolutely horrendous. There's almost no redeeming qualities about them. So the next tier is the D tier. These games I consider bad, but they have some redeeming qualities, so they're not completely horrible, but they're not good either. So yeah. So I debated with this one for a while. I actually had this a bit higher for a little bit, but then I thought about it more and I ended up dropping it a bit lower. And I'm sorry for I'm really, really sorry for the people who like this game, but Tag Team Racing, I don't think this game is good. I almost put it higher because I have started to have a slightly better opinion of it. But when I think about it, I still just I just don't like this game. The biggest problem is that like approximately like 20% of the game is really good, and then the rest of it's just shit. Like all of like the park exploration and the sandbox, like the wide open sandbox style and the platforming, that part's really cool. And like if that had been the focus of the game, I think this would have been a really good game. Unfortunately, the rest of the game exists. Like, the racing is horrible. Like, it has none of the depth of, like, CTR or CNK. And the clash mechanics is just fundamentally broken. Like, every race, you can just clash onto an enemy, let them do all the driving, and then at the end of the race, just detach and win. And I've heard people say, well, you could also, you could just not do that. But, for one, that's a bullshit excuse for 2 reasons. First off, if you don't clash, then you're still left with a shitty racing game. And then if you don't clash because you're like, oh, well, you can just enjoy it by not doing that, you're acknowledging that the game's primary selling point is fundamentally broken and not good. So that's not a valid argument for me. It's just, really, it's sad because part of the game is really good, but then the other part just really isn't. The part of the racing part of the game is honestly pretty terrible. And then other small points, all the characters are extremely out of character. None of them really resemble the personalities of their older games. And tragically, that kind of carried over into the Titans and Mind Over Mutant. Really, if the game was just better focused on the aspects of it that were really good, the game could have been a lot better. But because of the racing exists, it just drags it down a lot. And I wish part of me wishes I had a higher opinion of it because of how good the sandbox stuff is, but I can't get over just how bad the racing part of this game is. It just really just drags it down that much. All right, so next is, I'm not sorry about this one. I am completely unapologetic about this one right here. Because fuck everybody who thinks Crash Bash is a good game. This game sucks. And I will die on that fucking hill. Crash Bash is not good. Let's see. What are the issues with Crash Bash? The AI is complete and utter bullshit. They blatantly just cheats. Like, the AI cheats. You cannot tell me they don't. Like, adventure mode is repetitive as all sin, which is even worse because the AI cheats. And the absolute worst part about the adventure mode being so repetitive is that you need to play the adventure mode to unlock, like, a good 50% of the game. Like, what party game exists where you have to unlock some of the minigames? And, like, half of them are that. Most of the minigames, honestly, aren't even that good. For one, like, it's the same 4 minigames repeated over and over and over for each category, with the exception of Medieval Mayhem. Like, the number of good minigames is, like, Space Bash. There are a couple saving graces for Bash, though. When you play it with multiple people, especially when you play it with 4, it is at least a slightly salvageable, like, fun multiplayer experience for about 30 minutes. So, like, the game is definitely better with multiple people, but that doesn't really save it entirely. It just makes it slightly less painful. The soundtrack is pretty good. Like, Bash does have a legitimately good soundtrack. And if you play the game in Japanese, it becomes better because the sound effects are just pretty fun. They're just funny to listen to. But overall, like, Bash is not a good game. And for the love of God, please, please, please stop asking for a remake. Like, it's no. Like, if you want to kill Crash, get a Bash remake. But, like, God, guys, Bash is not good. Please stop asking for it. All right. So this next one I also debated a little bit just because I don't know how much of this is, like, my own personal bias. But the next one is Crash Purple. So I don't think this game's horrible. I don't think it's a particularly impressive game. I'm gonna turn the music down a little bit. I still can't hear myself think. Like, sorry. Yeah, that's better. Okay, now I can hear myself. So, like, with Crash Purple, I guess the biggest positives I have for this game is that even though the minigames aren't really particularly impressive, they're not really horrible. Like, they're cute. I enjoy them for what they are. Like, not really, like, drop dead amazing, but not really the worst thing I've ever experienced. That belongs to Crash Boom Bang. The other thing about the minigames is a lot of them actually draw elements of, like, classic Crash games. Like, you know, there's box breaking, there's a fair amount of platforming and stuff. So it still feels like it kind of blends into Crash, even though it's a minigame compilation. And it's definitely, like, not as bad as Spiral Orange. Like, that's the biggest thing, is that it's not Spiral Orange. Spiral Orange is just, like, horrendous compared to Crash Purple. The biggest thing with Purple, like, with both Purple and Spiral Orange, is it's really just a bunch of wasted potential. Like, a Crash and Spiral crossover could have been so much more, but it ultimately just was 2 fucking minigame compilations. And, like, really, the biggest way I can describe Purple is that it's just a mediocre game. It doesn't do anything outright horribly, but it also doesn't really do anything well. It's just it's a very below average game. That means I put it above Bash because it's not infuriating. Like, Bash is infuriating with how bad it can be. And then same with Tag Team Racing. Like, Purple is just eh. And that's why it's above these 2, but it's, like, below everything else. Yo, Gorillas. You did miss the run. Sorry. I got a PB, though. So. But yeah, that's why I have Purple down here. I think that's actually higher than a lot of people would put Purple, because I feel like a lot of people put Purple, like, down here. I really don't think Purple's that bad. But it's also just not good. So. Yeah, there is one part in Crash Purple where you do throw Molotov cocktails with Spyro, so that kind of just, you know, maybe it should be up here. So yeah. And then the last game in D tier, and this game, like, honestly, as more time goes on, like, this is, like, top of D or bottom of C, and that is, where is it? The Huge Adventure. Huge Adventure / XS if you live in the PAL region. Like, as far as classic Crash platformers go, this is definitely the worst one. The level design in Huge Adventure is absolutely awful. It's really, really fucking terrible. Like, there's a lot of blind jumps, there's a lot of leaps of faith, there's a lot of enemy placement that's just complete and utter bullshit. You can tell it was Vicarious Vision's first attempt with the series, because like the level design is absolutely horrendous. The game is honestly mostly fine if you just get the crystals, like if you just any percent it. Like, it's not good, but it's at least serviceable. But if you go for 101%, it's really bad, because the level design just becomes gradually more and more horrendous. It is probably the single most unoriginal game in the entire franchise. Like, everything about it just draws elements from 2 and 3, with the exception of Mega Mix. And Mega Mix is kind of cool, I guess. There's 4 underwater levels for some reason. Like, the biggest things that hurt, like, it's just like really shitty level design and just a total lack of originality. And it's like, it's not the worst thing ever. Like, if you want just a basic handheld, like, on-the-go Crash romp on the GBA, you can play this game. There's just so many better options. Like, literally any other classic Crash game is better than A Huge Adventure. Like, I see a lot of people like rate this game really highly, and I just don't get it. Because, like, it's... The level design is just horrendous. It really is. So... yeah, but that's the last of the games in D tier. So these are the only Crash games that I would call bad. And even then, like, it's a hard maybe for Huge Adventure. Huge Adventure, like, almost veers into okay territory. But yeah, these are the only Crash games I would consider bad. Everything else is average or better. So, like, a lot of people, like, shit on, like, the Crash series for being, like, just terrible after the Naughty Dog games, but I don't agree with that. So now we will go into the C tier. And this is overall, like, probably the smallest tier. These are the Crash games that I consider distinctly middle ground. They're just average. Like, they're not amazing, they're not bad, they're not great, but they're average, they're decent. The first one is Crash of the Titans. Despite the fact that this is very, very different from every game that came before it, I think for what it is, it's just like a standard like beat 'em up game. It's all right. Like, it's not amazing. It's not, I mean, it's not like Batman Arkham or Bayonetta or anything, but it's like a pretty solid combat-based game. One of my issues with it is that the platforming versus combat definitely skews a bit too much towards the combat side. Like, it's approximately like 30%. It's like 30%. Platforming and like 70% combat, and the mob fights in particular start to get like really draining towards the end. Like, it just as you progress through Titans, the game just really tends to drag out more. The mob fight starts to feel a bit more ridiculous, where you just get ganged up on, and it really feels like you can't really do much except for take it and just be overwhelmed and hope you don't die. The single biggest offender of this is the Uka Uka boss fight, where, like, I'm not really sure, like, aside from a cheese strategy like this, I'm not sure how you do that fight without dying at least once. And, like, the only thing that makes it okay is that dying doesn't actually lose any progress in that fight. One of the biggest things that really bothers me about Titans is, like, the dialogue is super fucking cringy. Like, it's legitimately painful trying to listen to the game. Just like the way the characters act and talk to each other. It's like they tried to be serious and take a more like story-driven approach, but they also tried to be funny, and like it's just not funny. It's just legitimately uncomfortable. Let's see what else. As far as the character designs go, I'm not really the biggest fan of all of them. I wouldn't say I hate all of them. I actually like Nina's redesign. I think Nina looks really fucking cool in this game and Mind Over Mutant. The rest of the character designs I generally like don't particularly care for. I think they look better before. The single worst offender is definitely Tiny. We're just not going to talk about that. The Titans Tiny just didn't happen. That was not a thing. So yeah, like Titans, like so I am guilty of this because I did this in my last tier list. I put Titans and Mind Over Mutant really low on the basis that they weren't good Crash games. now I don't really subscribe to that theory. Like, I don't really like the whole, this is a good game, but it's not a good insert series here game. I feel like when you do that, you start to judge something off of what you think it should be or what you wish it should be. But when you do that, you can't really judge it for what it is. And for what Titans is, even if it's not necessarily the direction I wanted Crash to go, I still think it's a pretty alright game. Like, I'm definitely glad this is not the way the series went permanently, but I can accept it as, like, at least an alright game. So I don't really want to do the whole it's a good game but not a good Crash game thing. I just don't really subscribe to that process of thought anymore. Alright, so these next two are essentially tied, because they're two versions of the same game, and it's just both versions of Crash Nitro Kart. Crash Nitro Kart, I would say, is probably the most distinctly average game in the series. Like, it is just like the dead center, like mid-tier Crash game, I feel. It did anti-grav before Mario Kart 8, so it was before it was cool. The like track design, I actually have grown to respect more, especially after like Nitro Fuel reintroduced them to like a lot of people. The tracks are actually pretty impressive in this game. One of the things that is kind of disappointing is that it's got less content than CTR. Like, each cup only has like 3 tracks, each hub only has 3 tracks, so you end up just having less to work with than CTR, which is tragic because this game is a lot older, or a lot newer rather. As far as how it handles, it feels really heavy, really sluggish, and really slippery, which is a really big contrast to CTR, which is, you know, crisp, fast-paced, very smooth, and all that. Like, really, at the end of the day, the biggest thing I can say about Nitro Kart is that it's not a bad game, but it's just so average, and it just doesn't live up to CTR at all. Like, really the biggest thing I can say about Nitro Kart is that it's just the most average Crash game in the entire series. Cnk Gba, I haven't played myself, but from what I've observed, it's basically a downscaled version of Cnk that still manages to be pretty solid. So it seems like, from what I've gathered, it's roughly the same quality as the console version. So I just ranked them together. Like, you can essentially say these two are tied. But yeah, that's everything in C tier. Those are the average Crash games. Alright, so now, get a bit more water. We go into the B tier. These are the Crash games that I consider solid. So these games are, I would definitely say they're better than average. They're at least decent. They might have a few things that annoy me, but overall they don't deter me from liking them. They're not quite as good as like the Crash games that I like love, but they're definitely like decent. All right. So the first game in here. And also, I'm just gonna go on a disclaimer that this game could potentially be a lot higher. I just have such little experience with it that I can't accurately judge it, but it didn't feel right to leave it off the list. And that is Titans DS. Again, this is a lot of like what I've played of it and what I've observed. I've only played the first few levels of this game, but I've also seen gameplay of like the later portions of it. And honestly, it seems like a really near perfect blend of both like the Titans games and like the classic Naughty Dog games. Like, it just manages to pull off being both of them. It looks like it's really well designed. Really the biggest thing is that I just haven't played it. So I don't really have a full grasp on it, but I honestly think that if I were to like manage to snag a copy of this and play it, and just fully experience it, this game could honestly jump an entire tier, because it looks like it has the potential to be just that good. Like, I've heard people tell me this is the best like handheld Crash game, and I would not be surprised if that ended up being true, but I haven't experienced it enough to actually have a solid opinion of it. But it felt wrong to call it anything less than solid, because I've never heard really any bad things about it. So I just put it at the bottom of B. Kind of just like a placeholder spot where like I know this game is good, but I haven't played it, so I can't like rate, like I can't put it higher. So yeah. The next game, And this is probably this is easily the biggest jump from the last list, and that's Mind Over Mutant. Because again, the last time I did a list, I put Titans and Mind Over Mutant in the low tier on the basis of they're not good Crash games. And honestly, I think replaying Mind Over Mutant is what killed my my thought process, like that mindset. Because Mind Over Mutant, again, despite being very different from the rest of the series, I honestly think is pretty good. It has it fixes a lot of the problems that I had with Crash of the Titans. Like, there's a much better balance of platforming versus combat. Like I said, in Titans, it's about like a 30-70 split. For Mind Over Mutant, the platforming to combat is actually pretty close to 50-50. It's the only Crash game that's really like open world. Like, people say Twinsanity is, but it isn't actually. I think Ramatron actually described it in his ESA run last week as a Metroidvania, and that's probably actually the best way to describe it, because you have this wide open world that's ultimately connected, but you gradually unlock pieces of it as you do more tasks, and like that, it's cool. Like, it wasn't executed the best. Like, I know people have an issue with the backtracking. I didn't really think it was that bad, but it was cool to have like that element of Crash to like actually have like an open world. The dialogue and humor are way better than Crash of the Titans. Like, it's actually pretty on point. This game's pretty funny. I don't think it's as funny as Twinsanity or Crash 4, but it has its moments where like it legitimately gets a laugh out of me. The animated cutscenes that all like copy various cartoon styles I thought was really cool. Bringing back Brio was neat. Like, Brio in this game is completely different from how he was in the original trilogy, but he still manages to be a really hilarious and entertaining character. Graphically, I didn't touch on this for Titans, but I'd say graphically Titans and Mind Over Mutant hold up fairly well. Like, the character models, again, really aren't that great, and they probably didn't age the best. But like, the environments I still think are really pretty. Really, the biggest issue with Mind Over Mutant is that it's so short. Like, you can beat this game in about 5 hours. Like, that's really the biggest problem with Mind Over Mutant, is that there's so little game to it, especially compared to Titans, which Titans to me is too long. But I would honestly take Mind Over Mutant being too short over Titans being too long. Yeah, this is generally from a casual standpoint, Static. I might sprinkle in like some speedrunning stuff, but generally this is me viewing it from a casual perspective. So yeah. I mean, overall, like, again, looking past how very different it is from the rest of the series, I think Mind Over Mutant's pretty solid, and like, I prefer judging it for what it is as opposed to what it's not. And yeah, I mean, seriously, I know that Mind Over Mutant has a lot of backtracking, but I really just don't think it's as bad as people make it out to be, which in part is because the game is so short. So really, the backtracking doesn't take that long. It's not a good element of the game, but I don't really think it's. I think people overstate how bad it is. Alright, so the last game in B tier is The Wrath of Cortex. If there is any trope or term that would best describe Wrath of Cortex, it's vindicated by history. Which basically means that the game was not liked when it came out, but as time has gone on, it's become more appreciated. And that really is the best way to describe Wrath of Cortex, is that, like, I remember this game coming out and nobody liked it. But now, like, a lot of people like it. So, like, Wrath of Cortex innovates extremely little. And that was considered a problem before, but generally, where the series went after this game came out, it's generally not considered a problem anymore. It's considered a good thing that it really didn't shake up the formula too much. It has one of the best soundtracks in the series. Like, the Wrath of Cortex soundtrack is just phenomenal. As far as like gameplay and physics go, this game is extremely floaty, which would generally be a bad thing to me, but for some reason, like, it doesn't really hurt this game to be as floaty as it is. I don't really think it benefits it, but there's very few spots where I feel like the game's floatiness is a problem. Really, the biggest issue with TWALK is that it's very, very reliant on vehicles, like, more so than like even Crash 3, and that's most commonly the biggest criticism. Like, out of the 30 levels in the game, only 8 of them do not have a vehicle of any kind, and 2 of them are Coco levels. And honestly, I wouldn't mind most of the vehicles if it weren't for the fact that a lot of them are really bad. Like, you know, you have stuff like the submarine or the droid or, you know, the Jeep. And they all just control like total ass. Like, not all of the vehicles are bad. Like, the plane is actually an improvement over Crash 3. And the atmosphere is just fucking amazing. Graphically, again, I use this phrase when I was doing Crash 3 earlier. Graphically, Wrath of Cortex is aged like a milk in a jacuzzi. The game looks super fucking ugly. But it was also like one of the earliest PS2 games, so that's like kind of the reason. Really, I think the best way I can describe Wrath of Cortex is that the game at its peak is overall pretty solid. Like, some of the best Crash levels are in this game. But this game's low points are really awful. Like, some of the worst levels in any Crash game. Like, think of like Coral Canyon, or like that's really my biggest one. Is Coral Canyon in particular is awful. You know, you can name a couple other levels that are pretty bad. Crash Droids is a general go-to. Force of Nature is a go-to. Smokey is a go-to. But like, this game when it's bad, like at its worst, is super infuriating. But at its best, it's pretty alright. So, that's really all I can say about it. It's like, it's a very safe game that people look back at more fondly now. And I definitely feel that way also. There's a lot of issues I have with this game, but I still think it's one of the more solid Crash games for sure. We already listened to this. We just listened to the original version. I'm going to skip this song. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree with that, Yellow. It's not what it should or could have been, but again, going back to Mind Over Mutant and Titans, I would rather judge it for what it is rather than what it's not. So yeah. And that's all of the B tier, actually. So now we're going into the A tier, and this is where, like, there's a lot of games in these last two tiers, as evidenced by there's, like, fucking 11 games down here. So yeah, I think most of the Crash games are pretty good. So the way I would describe the A tier is that these games are very good. Like, these are all games that I would recommend somebody play if they had never experienced them before. So yeah, the first one is the single most slept on game in the entire fucking series, and that is Crash Bandicoot 2 Entranced. This game rules. And every time I see somebody say it is the huge adventure but worse, I am convinced they do not know what good game design is. Because holy shit, this game slaps. Like, I really think that Entranced is the most underrated game in the entire series. It makes so many improvements over the Huge Adventure in terms of level design, in terms of difficulty. Like, it's a legitimate, decent challenge. It's not bullshit. Like, there's not, like, random enemies, like, all over the place. You don't have to make blind jumps every fucking second. One thing like that's kind of like understated about Entranced that I really like is that it was like the first game that tried to kind of deviate from the formula. But it still stuck to like most of the classic elements of Crash. Like, you know, you still have crystals, you still have level-based gameplay and all that, but like it was the first one that like really shook up the power-ups. Like, you start with the double jump, you start with the super body slam. It adds like the rocket jump, it adds the super slide, which is like the greatest power-up of all time. The level progression isn't exactly like a warp room where you have 5 options. You kind of have to like branching path, like figure out like what levels you can go to. There's more vehicles in Entranced compared to the Huge Adventure, but I feel like in like a lot of Huge Adventure's vehicles are really fucking annoying. Like, you know, like the underwater's awful, the bear is awful, and like the jetpack is just boring. Entranced vehicles for the most part I think are pretty alright. Like, the Coco Space levels are not that good. Spaced Out is probably the worst level in the game. But, like, the Atmosphere is solid. The Wakeboard is solid, and that's actually the only other 2 vehicles in the game. Well, I mean, there's also, like, there's the Helicopter Pack, which is alright, and then there's the Magic Carpet, which is just an auto-scroller, but, like, they don't feel like they're a problem. Like, they're definitely more abundant, but I don't have the issue with them, I guess. Let's see, what else is my notes? one of the things that I guess is an issue with Entrance is that 101% is brutal, because it requires you get all but one of the platinum relics, and the last relic has to be gold. But it's kind of offset by the fact that you can get the true ending without 101%. All you need for the true ending is to get all of the gem shards. But really, like, the biggest issues Entrance has is just that it's a GBA game. Like, it's technically limited by the console it's on. But despite that, it's still, like, I don't really have a lot of complaints with this game. It's just solid. And really, the only reason it's not any higher is just because the rest of the games are all really good, too. Like, it's mechanically the weakest of these 11 games. But it's still a really good one. Like, it is the single most underrated game in the series, I feel. And yeah, if you, like, play it on, like, emulation, it should be fine. It depends on the emulator, obviously, but it's generally a good option. No, you don't, Mikey. In the Japanese version, you need, like, most of the gems, but you don't need any relics for the true ending. Yeah, so, like, this is the most slept on Crash game. Like, nobody ever talks about Entrance, but I think this game is amazing. Alright. Alright, so like I said, I'm going to consider the Insane Trilogy 3 games, because for all intents and purposes, the Insane Trilogy is 3 games. So yeah, this next game is, in my opinion, the weakest game in the Insane Trilogy, and it hurts my heart to say this, but I think it's Crash 2. So, as far as Crash 2 NST goes, it's probably the least positively affected by the physics changes in NST, because, you know, like, NST has a faster falling speed, it has a lower jump, it has snappier air momentum, and I feel like that generally benefits Crash 1 and 3, which I'll elaborate on very soon. The reason I feel like it doesn't really positively benefit Crash 2 is because the original Crash 2's physics were already really good. So Crash 2 doesn't really benefit from them in that sense. And then on the flip side, I feel like the more negative aspects of NST's physics harm Crash 2 the most. The faster falling speed is actually a pretty big problem for this game. Like, the basic jump in 2 NST feels useless. The slow bounce speed, honestly, I think hurts this game more than it hurts Crash 1, with, like, the biggest offenders being the piston and away death route is way more annoying than it needs to be. Getting the bonus lives and, like, the air crash secret entrance or, like, the digging it bonus is, like, really, really obnoxious. So that's the biggest problem I have with 2 NST, is that, like, it doesn't really benefit from the positive aspects of the remake, but it is very adversely affected by the negative aspects of the remake. Visually, I think it is the blandest and ugliest of the 3 games in the trilogy, and I think it's going to age the poorest. Like, as time goes on, it's going to look worse and worse. And it's a really sharp contrast to the original Crash 2, which is an extremely colorful game, despite the fact that a lot of the environments are very similar. It still manages to stand out. Would you be better off grabbing the original Crash Trilogy games or playing the Insane Trilogy? I mean, you can take and go either way. Like, even though, like, I'm like criticizing Crash 2 a lot, it's still in the A tier. It's still a good game. I'm definitely partial towards the original games. So I would recommend those, but the Insane Trilogy is not a bad option. I think someone mentioned it, I don't see it in the chat anymore, but the music is a severe downgrade in Crash 2 NST, more so than in Crash 1 and Crash 3. Like, I feel like Crash 1 and 3 in NST actually have some pretty good remixes, but, like, I can't think of a song in the remake of 2 that I like more than the original, but I can think of a lot of them that I think are really bad. So that's a big thing. Now, one positive I will say about Crash 2 NST is the relics and the running shoes actually feel like a pretty nice organic addition to the game. They weren't done super tremendously, but they feel like they could have been there all along. They just feel like a nice addition to the game. So that is one thing that the remake has over the original, is that if you're really into time trials, then the time trials in Crash 2 NST are pretty good. So, like, overall, like, obviously, the game's an A tier. I don't think it's bad. I still think it's a very good game. It just has the impossibly high standard of trying to live up to the original Crash 2. And, like, it just doesn't reach it. And it just doesn't benefit from NST in the same way that the other two games do. So it just kind of looks subpar in comparison. And yeah, the only remix I can think of that I might like more than the original is Road to Ruin. But yeah, like Crash 2 NST is definitely a case of it's not bad, but it's just not as good as the other options. Alright, so next up we got... Hey, I was just playing this game. The original Crash 3. So I think the original Crash 3 is the weakest of the original trilogy, but that doesn't make it bad, hence why it's an A tier. I think out of the 3 games on the PS1, like the 3 PS1 platformers, it is the most unstable. Like it's just like the most fragilely built one. It is the one that like has the biggest issues with like frame drops and lagginess, things not functioning. This is not really something you notice too much playing casually, but like me speedrunning it has made me realize a lot more how like it's really just like a very, very delicately held together game. My biggest issue with this game, or at least one of my biggest issues with the game, is the physics. It is by far the floatiest game of the original 3, even compared to Crash 1, and especially compared to Crash 2. And combined with how air momentum works in the original trilogy, because in the original Crash games, you don't have total control in the air. Like, Crash kind of moves in an arc, so you can't just, like, immediately pivot around. You kind of have to, like, do, like, a weird swerve. That, combined with how floaty this game is, makes it really hard to do anything precise. The platforming as a whole is more bland than 1 and 2, I feel. Like, there are some pretty good levels. Like, all of the Arabian levels are really good. The future levels are pretty good. The Egyptian levels are pretty good. But then, like, the medieval levels and, like, the prehistoric levels, particularly Boneyard, are, like, super basic. Like, Dynamite's alright, I guess, and Oedipus Rex is pretty cool. But overall, I don't think the platforming is as interesting as 1 and 2. It is very dependent on vehicles. Not to the same degree as Twog, but about half of the game is vehicles. And that alone already, like, kinda concerns me. But the biggest issue is that a lot of the vehicles just aren't really that good. Like, they just don't work properly, or they just are very, very fickle. Like, you know, the jet ski with the waves. Like, you can very easily just miss a lot of crates, which in a game with time trials is a problem. The motorcycle is, like, not really too bad, but it's got this really big issue where if you hit a car and you're not turboing, then you just get sent, like, 5 miles to the left. The underwater controls are just really clunky, and for some reason, if you're, like, touching anything, you just have no momentum whatsoever when you spin. The plane is just really hard to aim with because there's no crosshair, and you constantly get centered when you go neutral. Really, like, I just feel like Crash 3 is the most volatile game of the original trilogy, where, like, when the game at its highest peaks is, like, honestly just as good or better than the other 2 games, but its low points are definitely the worst aspects of the original trilogy. It's still a very good game, and, like, replaying it as I've been doing 105% has caused me to have a better opinion of it, but I still think it's, like not super amazing. Like, it's a good game. I like it a lot. But it's got a lot of issues, I guess, is where I'm going with this. Alright. I need to turn the music down a little more. It's still blaring in my ears. Come on. Okay. So we got 2 more games in this tier. And the next one is the NST version of Crash 1. So, Crash 1 on, NST Crash 1 is one I'm fairly conflicted on, because the game makes a lot of objectively good improvements to the original, like, in terms of, like, mechanics and, like, save systems and checkpoint systems. You know, you can die and still get the gem. You don't have to beat the Tana's bonus rounds to, like, save the game. So like those are just like objectively good changes. Like nobody can argue that those are bad changes unless you're a masochist. The faster falling speed of NST is kind of like a mixed bag, because it definitely demands more precision, but I feel like it largely doesn't really matter for Crash 1. Like everything's still perfectly doable. The biggest issue is just that when the bounce mechanics are particularly fucky, which mostly goes with like the high road is like the biggest example, but that I don't really have. I put that less on the falling speed and more just bounces being terrible in NST. Overall, the atmosphere of the game is a lot brighter than the original. It's not really a bad thing, but if you're definitely if you're a fan of like the dark, eerie tone of the original Crash 1, it can be a bit of a turn off. So this is one that I've mentioned this a couple times when it's come up on stream, and I don't know how many people agree with this, but I actually think that the bonuses being required in the NST version of Crash 1 as opposed to the original where they were optional, I actually think it's a bad thing. Because I honestly feel like it throws off the flow of the game. Like if you play like Crash 1 on the PS1, it feels like it really flows, and the bonuses are just that, they're bonuses. And when you look at the design of a lot of the bonuses in Crash 1, you can tell that they were not intended to be fully completed. So that makes a lot of the bonuses in Crash 1 honestly pretty frustrating, especially like, you know, like the Brio bonus in like Heavy Machinery is a pretty good example of it. The time trials feel pretty tacked on, especially compared to Crash 2. Like I said, like in Crash 2 NSC, the time trials feel pretty like a pretty organic addition. Like they could have just been there all along. Crash 1, you can tell, was not built with time trials in mind. They feel really extra, and like they're not really. I don't know if I'd say they're bad, but they definitely don't feel as good. Okay, no, we're turning it. This is Bad Bombers. We're turning this up. Let's see where else. Visually, like in terms of graphics, I think it'll age better than Crash 2. Like I think overall the environments look prettier in Crash 1 than they do in Crash 2. Like I don't think Crash 1 NST is ugly. I don't think it'll age as well as Crash 3. So it's kind of like the middle ground in terms of graphics in NST. The fact that they brought back Stormy Ascent is really cool, because I think that is a really awesome level that was really, it was really sad that it got cut from the original Crash 1. So bringing that back as like an extra DLC level is definitely really good. Like, ultimately, Crash 1 NST is a hard one to gauge for me, because in terms of, like, quality of life and just not being frustrating, I think it is a massive improvement over the original Crash 1. Like, it definitely just makes a lot of changes that fix the more archaic issues with Crash 1. But I also feel for everything it fixes, it also takes, like, a couple steps backwards, mostly with, like, you know, how the physics handle with, like, the bouncing and the bonuses, like I said. I can honestly go either way with which version of Crash 1 I prefer, but generally right now I tend to lean towards the original, despite the original having a lot of major flaws. But like the NST Crash 1 is definitely not bad, and if someone didn't really want to deal with the more frustrating features of the original Crash 1, I would definitely recommend they play the remake because of that. Alright. So we got one more game in the A tier. And this is where we get really, really hot on the hot takes. And that is the NST version of Crash 3, which is the only one in the Insane Trilogy that I think is an improvement over the original. So yeah, I love the remake of Crash 3. I think it's great. And that is not a very common opinion. So, going back to how the physics changes in NST affect every game, I think that the negative aspects of NST harm Crash 3 the least. The lower, like, the slower bouncing doesn't really matter much for Crash 3 because there isn't a lot of bouncing. The precise platforming, again, doesn't really matter because the platforming is a lot more basic. the faster, like, snappier air physics, where, you know, like, you have a lot more control over Crash in NST compared to, like, the original games when he's in the air. I think it's really, really beneficial to Crash 3, whereas it's not really, it's either not beneficial or it's detrimental to 1 and 2. But it's like, that snappiness is a huge improvement over the floatiness of the original Crash 3. So it makes it overall, like, the platforming in the remake is a lot better handled, I feel. And this is where a lot of people leave me negative comments and thumbs downs on YouTube. Almost all of the vehicles in the remake of Crash 3 are better. Like, almost all of them. The only one that's bad is the fish, like, mech thing in the underwater levels, because it just literally doesn't work. But, like, every vehicle, despite how different it handles from the original, I think is a massive improvement in how much they function. Like, okay, like, Purah's still a little weird, but overall I would say he still generally functions better than he does in the original game. The motorcycle handles very differently with how it turns, but the wide turning when you turbo with it is actually really useful in, like, a lot of the later motorcycle levels, including, like Road Crash in particular is a lot better in the remake because of that. You don't get sent flying, like, 5 miles away to the left if you hit a car. And yes, even the jet ski is better in Crash 3 compared to the original. And when I say that, not necessarily the jet ski level, but the jet ski level. Or, like, jet ski levels are better. Like, the jet ski vehicle, you can say, goes either way. But the biggest thing that, like, the biggest issue people have with the jet ski is the wide turning. I don't think the turning in NST is that great. Like, I wish it didn't turn as wide as it did. I also think people overstate how bad it is. It's not something that can't be adjusted to. People like to play up the NST jet ski as if it's unplayable, but it's not. And the biggest thing is that the waves in the jet ski levels in 3 don't fuck you over. Like, there's no point in NST 3 where you get screwed over by the waves, with, like, the one exception is that sometimes you get screwed over with the underwater crate and hot cocoa, but it's really, really rare, even compared to how it was in the original. So, like, I take the functionality of actually being able to hit shit in the jet ski levels and not be like, oh, well, I guess I missed it because the game decided it. I take that in return for the turning kind of sucking, because that's something I can adjust to. Like, it's something you can become consistent at if you just bother to learn it. The plane is a massive fucking improvement because it actually has a crosshair and it doesn't constantly recenter you every time you're going neutral, which makes generally the functionality of those levels a lot better. Rings of Power is a bit rough because you have to actually know how to brake, but again, once you know how to brake, it's not a problem. Like, really, every single vehicle in the remake, in my opinion, is a massive improvement. People just need to stop bitching and just, like, accept that it doesn't control the same, and then think, well, maybe I could be better at it. Visually, I feel like it will age the best out of the 3 games, because Crash 3 just in general has the nicest looking environments. And, like, even though, like, Crash 2 looks pretty bland and Crash 1 is kind of, like, middle ground, I think Crash 3 in the remake is very pretty. The addition of Future Tense is really cool. I think that's a really fantastic level. I saw a lot of people in the chat saying they were surprised I didn't put this in S tier. The reason I didn't put this in S tier is because, despite how much I like it, it still has some of the issues I have with Crash 3. Mainly, it's very heavily reliant on vehicles, and that's, like, one of the biggest downsides for it for me. So, like, it fixes a lot of the problems of Crash 3, but it can't fix all of them, which is why I put it at the top of A. Like, I did almost put it in S, but it's still, like, there are some fundamental flaws about the game in terms of, like, vehicles and shit. But yeah, this could have also been an S tier. Alright. But yeah, so that's all the Crash games I consider very good. So now we are ending with the S tier, which are the games that I consider the best. Like, these are all Crash games that I think are absolutely fucking phenomenal and everybody should play them. And the first one, and this was one that, like, I kind of surprised myself when I put it up this high, but, like, revisiting it, like, very recently reminded me, like, how much I fucking love this game, and that's Crash 1. Like, Crash 1 is fucking amazing. Like, it's so good, really, I feel. So, like, Crash 1 hasn't aged quite as well as Crash 2 or 3. Like, it shows its archaicness more than those 2 games do. but I don't think that means it aged poorly. Like, when I think of a game that aged poorly, I think of Super Mario 64. Crash 1 is still an extremely playable game. Out of the original trilogy, I think Crash 1 has the best level design because it has the most emphasis on pure platforming and like tricky platforming. Like it just has some of the coolest level design overall. It's the most atmospheric game in the original trilogy, just like through the combination of like the music and the environment and just like it just sets the perfect tone for every single level. I love the linear progression of it. Like, even though it's not a warp room system, I love how the level progression as you go through every level kind of tells the story of the game. You know, like Crash, he wakes up on Insanity Beach after escaping from Cortex. He goes through like all the native villages and all that, goes through like the ruins of the second island, and then eventually reaches Cortex's island, goes through all of his like his machinery, you know, scales his castle, saves Tawna. I think that's one of the coolest aspects about this game, is that it actually forms a coherent plot. The game also has a very low-key, like, environmental message going on, which I think was another pretty cool aspect of it. Is just that it has that little thing going on. That's a bit of a more minor point. The game's more archaic mechanics can definitely be frustrating. Like, definitely, you know, the whole, like, if you die, you have to reset the level to get the gem. And the save system is mega fucked because you can only save after Tawna bonus rounds and shit. I think this becomes less of an issue nowadays with the age of like emulation and save states, and there's password generators online where like you just say like what progress you want, and then it'll give you a password to make to up to that save point. So if you didn't have a save file, you can just like copy what progress you had. And like I feel like somebody's gonna be like, oh, well, that's not really part of the game. That's just, like, anti-frustration due to emulation and shit. But, like, when I think about it, like, you're not wrong. But there's so many games from, like, the previous console generation, you know, from the SNES and NES era, that are also have, like, the same issues that Crash 1. You know, like, the lack of a save system or lack of a good checkpoint system or whatever. But are still held up in really high regard because they're just really good games anyway, despite that. And then, like, using save states to beat them isn't really totally frowned on unless they're a fucking gatekeeper. So, like, I feel like Crash 1 is definitely guilty of archaic mechanics, it's no more guilty of it than, like, other games of, like, previous generations that are still considered really good. So I don't really see it as too much of a setback. Crash 1 sucks because it doesn't have analog. I know you mean that as a joke, hopefully, but like actually Crash 1's level design doesn't really need analog. Like it's so linear compared to 2 and 3. So it's generally not even an issue. One of the biggest issues of Crash 1 is just the difficulty is very erratic. Like the way I describe the way I describe the difficulty of Crash 1 is that it's a heartbeat. Because, like, one of the hardest levels is Native Fortress, which is the 7th level in the game. So that's probably, like, the biggest turnoff of Crash 1 is that the difficulty is just all over the place. But, like, in spite of every issue with Crash 1, I think all of its positive elements just greatly outshine it. And, like, even in the presence of, like, you know, like, the sequels and its remake, I still think it's a very strong game, and I think it's one of the best games in the series. Like, every time I play more of the original Crash 1, I just continue to appreciate it. I think the game is fantastic. I was also having a nice firefly. Alright, so I gotta rush this a little bit because I'm running out of time. And speaking of time, we're on Crash 4. So for all you people asking what I thought about Crash 4, this is your answer. Crash 4, I think, is one of the... it's a massive return to form for the series. Like, this is the game that the series desperately needed. It brings the series back to its roots, but also innovates enough where it doesn't feel unoriginal. Like, it's not TWAC levels of unoriginal. It innovates the game... It innovates the series in the way it needed to, but also doesn't forget what makes Crash so good. The level design, honestly, is probably the best in the entire series. I think the level design in Crash 4 is incredibly clever, incredibly fantastic. It's hard, but it's hard usually in a fair way that rewards you for learning, which is especially amplified by the fact that it finally got rid of the life system, which is super archaic and unnecessary. And because you don't get punished with like game overs or whatever, it gives you the opportunity to like actually learn the levels and figure out what you're supposed to do to clear everything. It is probably the most aesthetically beautiful game in the entire series. Like, this game is fucking gorgeous. I just love looking at it. Like, the character models are all fantastic. They're so expressive. The environments are beautiful. The physics are extremely well done. Like, you probably have more control over Crash in Crash 4 than any other game in the series. Like, it's just so phenomenally done. As far as like gimmicks go, like all of the gimmicks, you know, with the Quantum Mask or like the extra playable characters, they don't really feel tacked on like the vehicles do in Crash 3 or Twok, because they expand on the platforming, so they feel like an extension of the core elements of Crash, and just again, an organic part of the game. I like that they took a very compelling approach to the story. They tried to have a legitimate plot. I think they did a pretty good job. Again, this goes back to like the level progression of Crash 1 being very linear. It kind of does the same thing in Crash 4. As far as like, oh, and also like the flashback tapes are also like a good aspect. Like, there's a lot of fleshing out of the characters between like the plot and just like the flashback tapes and the backstories and shit. As far as issues I have with the game, for the most part, I think the difficulty is fair, but it's not completely devoid of bullshit. There's definitely a lot of times where the game just kind of feels stupid, and overly frustrating. As far as hidden crates and hidden gems go, I think most of them are pretty reasonable. Like, they give you a fair amount of hints to figure out how to do it. But at the same time, there are some that are pretty bullshit. And even in the absence of the bullshit ones, there's just such a high concentration of hidden crates and hidden gems that by the time you get to the end of the game, it's so overwhelming and draining that it kind of kills the enthusiasm, even though you are rewarded for figuring it out for yourself. Like, that was the biggest thing. I was like, I didn't feel like it was bullshit, but I just felt like it was too much. 106% completion of this game is just bad. It's terrible. It's super repetitive because every level requires a minimum of 3 visits, because you need the normal version, you need the inverted version, and you need the time trial. It doesn't even factor dying for insanely perfect relics or missing any of the crates or the gems. Like, you're gonna replay the game a lot to 106%, and I think that's really probably the worst aspect about this game, is that full completion is so repetitive. But ultimately, I don't think it really ruins the game. It's just like a pretty sad aspect of it. So like, honestly, I think for better or worse, Crash 4 takes all of the elements that the series is known for and just amplifies them to 11. But that means it amplifies all of the amazing aspects of Crash, but it also amplifies all of the bad aspects of Crash. So it is probably the most extreme Crash game. It's got a lot of issues, but I think overall it was an absolutely fantastic game. It was something the series desperately needed, and it was definitely a step in the right direction. But the issues I have with it stopped me from considering it like one of my favorites. It's up there, like it's fifth, but it's definitely not like in contention for my favorite. The one thing that pissed you off is that I made the dev times an official relic. I don't really see how that's an issue, because they're not required for completion. Like, that's just like a bonus thing. So I don't really have an issue with that. All right, number 4 is CTR. So CTR prior to like NF was probably, in my opinion, the greatest kart racer of all time, and it still holds up even in the wake of the remake. It's like, I already touched on this with Cnk. It's a very crisp game. The gameplay is very fast. There's a lot of depth and there's a lot of advanced mechanics, which just really makes it a game that just gets better the more and more you learn about it. The adventure mode is phenomenal, to the point that even though the adventure mode is super repetitive, it's not really a problem, because CTR is just that fun to play. Like, it's just, the gameplay is just that good. Like, I don't really have any complaints with the original CTR. The biggest setback is just the small amount of content and just like the physical limitations of multiplayer, which are both just both products of it being a PS1 game. Like, they physically couldn't do any more with it. But like, I don't really have a lot of problems with CTR, and I don't really have too much more to say about it. So I'll just go into the next thing, which is CTR Nitro Fueled. which this will touch on a lot of the same things with CTR. Nitro Fuel did something that I honestly thought was impossible. It took the original Crash Team Racing and managed to make it better, which I did not think was gonna happen. As far as the entire series goes, CTR is completely unmatched in how much content is in this. Like, you have every racer and every track from CTR and CNK. You have a bunch of extra racers they added over time. There's like hundreds of skins, hundreds of card optimizations. Like, there's just so much you can do with this game. The mechanics aren't as deep as the original CTR. Like, they got rid of a lot of like the unintended tech, but it's still a really crisp, really fast-paced game. There's still a lot of depth to it. It's still an absolute blast to play. As far as the online goes, I don't actually hate it. Like, I'm not gonna say the online's perfect because it's very obviously not. There's a lot of issues with the online, but I don't think it's unplayable. It obviously depends on your internet connection, but I still found online to overall be pretty fun. And the fact that it exists at all is already just an upgrade from the previous game, because like CTR and CNK didn't have online. So like that, like a playable, albeit not really that good online, I'll take over no online at all, essentially. It pulls characters and references from like the deepest depths of the franchise, like Yaya Panda. Like, it's such a fucking big love letter to the entire series, and like you can tell they put so much effort into the game. And Ray is getting ahead of me on this. The game's single biggest flaw is its load times. Like, the load times are abhorrent. They are so bad, and they got worse with every update. It's kind of alleviated if you play on PS5 or Xbox Series X, but first off, Lamau having a PS5 or Xbox Series X at the current point in time. But also, from what I've heard, that kind of fucks up the online, so you kind of have to choose between having playable online or better loads. And really, like, that's the only thing that keeps me from considering this game for number one. Is just that the load times are really just that bad. Like, it really brings the game down a lot. Like, not enough to make me think it's not a good game, because CTR is absolutely fucking phenomenal. Like, loads aside, this game is like, it smashed every expectation I had for it. Like CTR and F is, in my opinion, probably the greatest kart racer ever made, with its primary competitor being the original CTR. If it weren't for the terrible loads of NF, it wouldn't even be a competition. Like, CTR and F would just completely stomp every other Crash game. PS4 had low load times. I played it on PS4 Pro and had like 25 to 30 second load time, so I disagree. Alright, so we got 2 games left, and if anybody knows me, you know how this is going to turn out. So number 2 is Crash 2. I would also like to say that it's really close between Crash 2 and the last game. So like, Crash 2 is very close to being my number 1. Crash 2 is the first video game I ever owned and ever like really played. Overall, Crash 2 is the most well-balanced and solid game in the series. Its biggest strength is that it does remarkably little wrong. Like, there's so few things that I would say are a problem in Crash 2. It took all of the biggest issues with the original Crash 1 and completely fixes them. The level design from a platforming perspective isn't quite as strong as Crash 1. I still think Crash 1 has better level design. But overall, I still think it's extremely solid. Like, it's still very good level design. I really appreciate the secrets in the game. Like, the colored gems and the secret exits, I think they're very cleverly hidden, and they encourage you to be creative. Compared to, like, Crash 3 and Crash 1 secrets, which tend to be either pretty cryptic or way too obvious. So it rewards you for, pardon my pun, thinking outside the box. I think out of the original trilogy, it has the best physics, because it's not too floaty like Crash 3 is, but it's not too stiff like Crash 1 can be sometimes. Overall, it's just like the best one to control, I feel. As far as the soundtrack goes, it's my favorite of the original trilogy soundtrack. It has the most variety to it. And like most of my favorite songs in the series are from this game. The most commonly cited criticism I have for the original Crash 2 is branching paths that cause backtracking, but I honestly never got why this was a problem. Like, I've heard people call it like that's like a bad thing that you have to backtrack, but I really never thought that was a big deal. So yeah, like there's just so little that Crash 2 does wrong. And if I wanted to be quote unquote objective, I would probably consider it the best Crash game. It sets such a high bar that it's just so hard to reach. But yeah, I'm gonna shift the song a little bit. Where is it? All right. So unless you've never seen me before, this shouldn't surprise you at all. And yes, I acknowledge I am biased. I just really love this game, and I know this is a hot take. But yes, my favorite Crash game is still Crash Twinsanity. Crash Twinsanity is the single most divisive game in the entire series. You have people who love this game, like me, and you have people who hate this game with every fiber of their being. I get that. I get that not everybody's going to agree with this. I get some people are probably going to want to behead me for this, but I am of the camp that I think this game is fucking amazing. I think Twinsanity has really, really good level design that, for one, it is very solid at combining platforming and like puzzle solving aspects. It takes very good advantage of like the 3D environment and the fact that you can actually control the camera. Like I think of levels like, you know, Ice Climb and Antagony, where like it actually is beneficial to like look around and see where you're supposed to go. I think it like goes really all out in just general level design. It introduces a lot of gameplay styles and gimmicks, but it actually manages to do most of them really well. Like the gameplay in this game shifts a lot, but it never really feels bad, I feel. Twins doesn't deserve an S even if you love it. Why? Fuck it. It's an opinion. If you love it, then rank it S. Like, that's how I feel about it. The one thing I really like about Twinsanity is that it takes the series in a new direction and tries to revitalize it. Like, it tried to shake up the formula, but it also doesn't forget most of the core elements that make Crash what it is. Like, you can still feel that it's a Crash game. Like, yeah, it's not, it does change up a lot from like previous games. You like to be realistic even with your own biases? Alright, that's cool. You can do that with your own tier list. The dialogue and humor in Twinsanity is quite honestly unparalleled. It's an absolutely hilarious game. It's like, it's so quotable and so memeable. The characterization in the game is phenomenal, particularly with Cortex. Like, this is the game that made Cortex an interesting character. Like, Cortex before Twinsanity was bland, generic, Lamau, I'm evil, just for the sake of it. Twinsanity Cortex is where Cortex became a really, really entertaining character and one of the best aspects of the franchise. The soundtrack is amazing. Just, you know, all the acapella and shit. I'm gonna go back to playing another song in it because I like listening to it. There we go. Like, it's just like, where was I? I have so many points about this game because I just love it so much. It was the first real attempt at a serious plot for the series. It doesn't do the best job. It's a bit scattered all over the place, but I think for the most part it's fairly coherent and pretty solid. So I want to touch on some of the game's criticisms that I don't entirely agree with. The game's brokenness. Like, yes, the game is very broken. Like, anybody who tells you Twinsanity is not broken is lying to themselves. But I don't think it's an issue when you're playing casually. Like, I see people use Twinsanity's brokenness as an argument against it, but you have to be trying to break this game. Like, sure, you might get like a random one-off glitch here and there, but that's literally like every Crash game does that. Like, if you see the shit I do in a Twinsanity speedrun and think you're gonna run into that casually, you're mistaken. Like, there's like Sonic 06 or like Superman 64 broken where they're unplayable because of how glitchy and buggy they are. And then there's Twinsanity where, like, if you didn't know it was broken, you probably wouldn't find out by just playing it casually. Like, you really wouldn't. The game's rushed, like unfinished development is honestly fairly misleading. The final product is stable and coherent, and yes, there was a lot of cut content and cut concepts that they had, but I don't know if I'd say the game was unfinished. It definitely wasn't rushed. Like people would say it's rushed. This game had a 3-year development cycle, and the development got restarted in like the last year or something. So I guess in that sense it might have been rushed, but it was more just like the development just had a lot of troubles that were just doomed from the start. I'm not gonna pretend the game is flawless, because it's not. It definitely has a lot of issues. It also suffers from a largely erratic difficulty curve, like with Crash 1. And it's a pretty short game. But overall, like, even though it's far from perfect, I think like all of the things about this game that I think it does well, it just does so well that it just I love Twinsanity. That's just how it is. I love Twinsanity. Like, yeah, it's a very divisive game. Like, not everybody loves it. I understand if people don't like it. Like, it's very out there. But that's the thing. This is my tier list. And I fucking adore Twinsanity. I think the game is phenomenal. And again, like, and I will go back to the whole, like, Mind Over Mutant Titans thing. A lot of people will be like, oh, well, it would have been really good if it had been finished. Or, like, it's good for what it is, but it could have been a lot better because of all this stuff that they cut out. Like, no, fuck that. I like it for what it is. I like, where is it? Fucking, this Crash Twinsanity right here, the one that I bought and put into my Xbox when I run it. I love this Crash Twinsanity. Would have been cool if there was more to it, sure, but I like this. Like, that's great, but I like this. So yeah. But yeah, so I've rambled on for quite a lot at this point. I think this actually might have ended up being longer than the other one. So yeah. But yeah, that's my tier list. Agree, disagree, tell me I'm right, tell me I'm wrong, tell me I'm an idiot, tickle my balls, I don't fuck. Like, comment, subscribe, fuck it. Yeah, like, I know that not everybody's gonna agree with all of this, because what fun and interest would there be if what I said was the absolute truth, and like everybody like thought the exact same as me. Kalashnik, I don't know if you were here when I explained the issues I had with Huge Adventure, but again, I'm going to put this on YouTube so you can go back and check it. I have a lot of problems with the game's design, essentially, is why Huge Adventure is down there. Yeah. But yeah, so that's generally how I feel about the Crash games. I feel pretty comfortable with this one, for the most part. I think this is definitely a lot better and more well thought out than my old one. So yeah. I'm running late for work, so I'm gonna call it here. But yeah. Let me find somebody to send you guys to. Alright. I haven't raided... Why is Murkaz live? I was gonna raid Potty, but I guess I'll raid Murkaz. Yes, I did see him, Mikey. I do keep track of everything. Alright, yeah, I'm gonna send you guys over to Murkaz. Raid message is wait a minute. But yeah, that's my tier list. That's my my garbage opinions. You can feel free to tell me that you don't care about my garbage opinions. But yeah, I will see you guys tomorrow. Alright, later.
Nice fucking dropped slide. Yeah, Rico, thanks.
Oh, I lost